I bought the dress 6 months before my son's wedding. It wasn't expensive and it wasn't fashionable. It was soft blue, simple and quiet. The kind of dress a mother chooses when she wants to look respectful without drawing attention to herself. When I held it in the store, I remember thinking that it felt right, like something meant for a meaningful moment. I brought it home and hung it carefully in my closet. I didn't rush. I smoothed the fabric with my hands and made sure it had enough space. Every few weeks, I would open the closet door just to look at it. Sometimes I touched the sleeve. Sometimes I stood there longer than I meant to, imagining the day I would finally wear it. I imagined sitting in a small chair at the ceremony, listening to quiet music, watching my son smile the way he did when he was proud. I imagined standing when the guests stood, clapping politely, and telling myself not to cry too much. I imagined feeling full but not loud, present but not in the way. At night, when the house was silent, I practiced my smile in the bathroom mirror. I practiced breathing slowly. I practiced holding my emotions the way women of my generation were taught to do. Not because I wasn't happy, but because I believed happiness should be graceful. Mark was my only child. After his father passed away, everything in my life grew smaller and quieter. The house echoed. The days felt longer. Mark became the center of my world, not by choice but by love. I worked extra shifts when I was tired. I skipped vacations I had promised myself. I told friends I would travel someday, maybe later when things settled down. I saved every extra dollar because I wanted Mark's life to feel easier than mine ever had. When he told me he was getting married, I felt a sense of relief I didn't know how to explain. It felt like a chapter closing gently instead of painfully. I felt proud. I felt hopeful. I welcomed Nina into my life with open arms. I wanted her to feel safe with me. I wanted her to know I wasn't a threat or a burden or someone she had to compete with. When they struggled financially, I helped. When rent was due, I sent money without being asked twice. When groceries ran low, I filled the gap. I told myself this was love. I told myself this was what family looked like. That dress stayed in my closet, waiting quietly. I believed my moment would come. I didn't know that one simple phone call would change everything I thought I knew about my place in my son's life. I remember the day I called them very clearly. It was a quiet afternoon. The kind of afternoon where the house feels still, and time seems to move slowly. I had just finished folding laundry, and the sun was coming in through the window in a soft, gentle way. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt urgent. I simply realized that the wedding must be getting close. I checked the calendar on my wall and counted the weeks again. I hadn't received an invitation, but I told myself that younger couples do things differently now. Maybe everything was digital. Maybe they were busy. I didn't want to seem demanding, so I waited. That day, I decided it was reasonable to ask. I picked up my phone and called Nina. I remember smiling as it rang. I remember feeling calm. There was no fear in me yet. When she answered, we exchanged a few polite words. She sounded distracted, but I didn't think much of it. People planning weddings are always busy. Then I asked my question. I asked what time I should arrive at the wedding. The silence that followed felt strange. It wasn't brief or accidental. It stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. I even pulled the phone away from my ear to check the screen. Then Nina spoke. Her voice was casual, almost careless. She told me the wedding had already happened. She said it was the day before. For a moment, my mind refused to accept what she had said. I laughed softly, the way people do when they think they've misunderstood something. I told myself there had to be more to the sentence. Some explanation waiting to follow. But then she continued. She said they had kept it very small. She said only special people were invited. I didn't know what to say. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I felt as if the air had been pulled from the room. I managed to say something polite before ending the call, though later I couldn't remember what it was. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that. The phone felt heavy in my hand. The house felt quieter than it had ever felt before. I told myself not to overreact. I told myself there must have been a misunderstanding. I told myself my son would call soon and explain everything. He didn't. That night I opened my closet. I stood there in the dim light, looking at the dress. It hung exactly where I had placed it months earlier. Untouched. Unwrinkled. Waiting. I reached out and touched the fabric. It felt the same as it always had, but I felt different. I wondered when I had stopped being special. It wasn't until I opened my phone the next day that I realized this wasn't a mistake at all. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I hadn't slept well, but I also hadn't cried. There was a strange numbness in me, like my emotions were standing still, waiting for instructions. I made my coffee the same way I always did. 2 scoops. No sugar. I sat at the kitchen table and stared out the window watching the light change. I told myself I needed answers. I picked up my phone and opened social media. Not because I expected to find anything, but because habit guided my fingers before logic could stop them. I hadn't gone there for the wedding. I hadn't even thought about it. And then I saw it. The first photo loaded slowly. A white dress. A bouquet. Smiling faces. My heart sank before my mind caught up. I scrolled. There was my son, standing tall in a dark suit. He looked confident. Happy. Older than I remembered him looking. Beside him stood Nina, glowing, surrounded by people I recognized immediately. Her parents were there. Her sister was there. Friends were laughing. Glasses were raised. Arms were wrapped around shoulders. Everyone looked relaxed. Included. Chosen. I scrolled further, hoping somehow I had misunderstood the first image. But there were more. Many more. Different angles. Different moments. A dance. A toast. A group photo where everyone leaned in close. Everyone except me. I sat very still as I looked at those pictures. My hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't change. What I felt was deeper than shock. It was clarity. This wasn't an elopement. This wasn't spontaneous. This was planned. I noticed small details that hurt more than the obvious ones. The table settings. The flowers I recognized from a shop I had helped pay for. Nina's dress, elegant and carefully chosen. The same dress she had asked me to help cover because she said money was tight that month. I remembered sending her $800 without hesitation. I remembered telling her not to worry, that weddings were expensive, and she should enjoy the moment. She had. Just without me. I closed the app and set my phone down carefully, as if it were fragile. I didn't feel angry yet. Anger came later. What I felt then was something quieter. Something heavier. I walked into my bedroom and opened the closet again. I took the dress off the hanger for the first time. I held it against myself and looked in the mirror. I didn't look foolish. I looked invisible. That afternoon my son finally called. I watched the phone ring. I watched his name appear on the screen. For the first time in my life I didn't rush to answer. I let it ring until it stopped. When I finally returned the call later, his voice sounded rehearsed. Calm. Controlled. He told me it was small. He told me it was complicated. He told me I wouldn't understand. I listened quietly. And when the call ended, I realized something important. No explanation was coming that would make this hurt less. It wasn't until a week later, when the phone rang again, that AIM realized they still expected something from me. 7 days passed. Not quickly. Not slowly. They passed the way days do when you are waiting for something you don't want to face. I went through my routine as usual. I cooked for one. I watered my plants. I folded laundry that didn't need to be folded yet. I didn't hear from my son during that week. No apology. No explanation. No invitation to talk things through. The silence felt intentional, like a door that had been quietly closed. On the 7th day my phone rang. When I saw Nina's name on the screen, my first instinct was to ignore it. But old habits are difficult to break. I answered. Her voice sounded different. The confidence was gone. The smooth, polite tone she used when everything was going her way had been replaced by urgency. She spoke quickly, barely stopping to breathe. She told me the rent was overdue. She said the landlord was pressuring them. She said if they didn't pay by the end of the week, they could be forced to leave. She asked if I had forgotten to make the transfer. I held the phone away from my ear for a moment and stared at the wall. I wasn't shocked by what she said. What surprised me was how natural it sounded to her. As if nothing had happened. As if the wedding had never existed. As if I were still playing my usual role. For 3 years I had been the one who made sure the rent was paid. $500 every month. On time. No reminders needed. I had done it quietly, without expecting thanks. I thought about all the times I had canceled plans to make sure that transfer went through. All the times I had worried about my own bills later so they wouldn't have to worry at all. Nina kept talking. She told me they were stressed. She told me this wasn't a good time for problems. She told me they were counting on me. I waited until she finished. Then I spoke. My voice surprised even me. It was calm, steady, almost gentle. I told her I only help special people. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate. Heavy. I could almost hear her breathing change. She asked what I meant. She said she didn't understand. She reminded me that we were family. She said I was like a second mother to her. I listened, remembering every time she had used that same soft voice to ask for money. For clothes. For repairs. For trips. For things I was never invited to be part of. I told her that being special meant being included. It meant honesty. It meant respect. She didn't respond right away. When she finally did, her voice trembled. She asked what they were supposed to do now. I ended the call politely. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that. My hands rested on the table. My coffee went cold. For the first time in years, I felt something unfamiliar. Relief. That night I cried. Not because I felt guilty, but because I finally understood how much of myself I had given away without realizing it. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with my bank statement spread out in front of me, and I finally decided to look at the numbers. Small notebook I usually kept tucked away in a drawer. I didn't rush. I moved slowly, deliberately, the way someone does when they know the truth will hurt but needs to be seen. For years I had avoided doing this. Not because I couldn't handle the math, but because I couldn't handle what the numbers represented. Every transaction carried a memory, a reason, a promise I had made to myself that this would be the last time. I started with the rent. $500 a month. 36 months. I wrote the total down carefully. $18,000. I paused and took a sip of coffee. Then I moved on to groceries and household supplies. $200 a month, sometimes more when they were struggling. Over 3 years it added up faster than I expected. I wrote the number down and felt my chest tighten. There were birthday gifts. Holiday gifts. Anniversary presents. Things I bought not because they asked but because I wanted to be included. I wanted to feel useful. I wanted to feel needed. Then came the emergencies. A medical bill here. Car repair there. A broken appliance. Each time I told myself that families help each other. Each time I believed that one day it would balance out. It didn't. When I finished adding everything together, I stared at the final number in silence. It was more than $30,000. Money I had taken from my savings. From my retirement. From the life my late husband and I had planned together. Money I would never get back. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. That money represented 3 years of saying yes when I wanted to say no. 3 years of believing that love had to be earned through sacrifice. 3 years of confusing generosity with obligation. I realized something important in that moment. They hadn't just taken my money. They had taken my time. My peace. My sense of self. The phone rang while I was still sitting there. It was my son. I watched his name light up on the screen. Normally my heart would have jumped. I would have answered immediately, hoping for reassurance, hoping for an apology. Instead I let it ring. 10 minutes later it rang again. This time it was Nina. I didn't answer. A message came through shortly after. He said they needed to talk. He said it was urgent. I deleted the message. That afternoon I went for a walk. Not to the bank. Not to the store. Just a walk. I passed the park where I used to take my son when he was little. I remembered how tightly he used to hold my hand. I remembered thinking that if I did everything right, he would always stay that sweet. Somewhere along the way, I had taught him that my love came with a price tag. And I had paid it willingly. By the time I got home, my decision was made. The next day, I walked into the bank, not to give them more money but to take my life back. The next morning, I dressed carefully, as if I were preparing for something important. In a way I chose a simple outfit and brushed my hair the way I always had before difficult conversations. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt focused. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't acting out of fear or guilt. I was acting out of clarity. The bank was quiet when I arrived. I had been there countless times over the years. Always for the same reason. Transfers. Deposits. Fixing problems that weren't mine to fix. The branch manager recognized me immediately. He smiled kindly and asked how I could be helped. I told him I needed to cancel the automatic transfers. He looked at me in surprise. Those payments had been scheduled like clockwork for years. He asked if everything was all right. I told him everything was finally very clear. He nodded without pressing. While he worked on the computer, I felt my phone vibrate in my purse again and again. I didn't need to look to know who it was. When the paperwork was finished, he slid it across the desk and asked me to sign. My hand didn't shake. With that signature, the monthly payments ended. I also asked him to remove any access my son or his wife might have had to my accounts. I asked about additional protections, passwords, alerts, safeguards. He listened carefully and treated me with more respect in those few minutes than I had felt from my own family in months. When I left the bank, the air felt different, lighter, as if I had set down something heavy I didn't realize I was carrying. At home, I turned my phone off completely. For the rest of the day, I did ordinary things. I cooked dinner. I watched the evening news. I read a few pages of a book I had abandoned months ago because I was always tired. That night, I slept deeply. The next day, I noticed something strange. No messages. No calls. The silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt tense, like the calm before a storm. That afternoon, I went out for groceries. When I returned, I noticed 3 cars parked near my house. 2 of them I recognized immediately. My heart skipped. They had my key. I stood in my driveway for a moment, breathing slowly, reminding myself that fear was exactly what had kept me trapped for so long. I walked to the front door and let myself inside. My son was sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. Nina was pacing back and forth, her movements sharp and restless. A man I didn't recognize was standing near my dining table, flipping through papers. My papers. They all looked up at me as if I were the one who didn't belong there. I set my purse down slowly. I asked what was going on. That was the moment I realized they hadn't come to talk. They had come to take control. The man I didn't recognize stepped forward first. He was well-dressed, confident, and held a folder under his arm as if he belonged in my home. He introduced himself as a lawyer. A family attorney, he said, speaking slowly, carefully, as if choosing words meant to calm a difficult child. I didn't offer him a seat. My son finally looked up at me. His eyes didn't hold worry or concern. They held panic, the kind that comes from realizing something valuable is slipping away. He told me they went to the bank. He said they were confused. He said the transfers had been stopped and access had been removed. Nina spoke next. Her tone was softer than before, practiced. She said they were worried about me. She said my behavior had been strange lately. She mentioned stress, loneliness, my age. The word age hung in the air longer than it needed to. The lawyer cleared his throat and explained that they were concerned about my ability to manage my finances. He said they wanted to help. He said there were legal options to protect everyone involved. I understood immediately. This was not a conversation. This was an attempt to take my independence. I walked over to the dining table and gathered my papers without rushing. Bank statements, personal documents, things no one had the right to touch. I told them calmly that those were private. My son tried to interrupt. He said they only wanted what was best for me. He said families help each other. He said I was overreacting. Nina reached for my hand. I stepped back. She told me I was confused. She said people my age sometimes made impulsive decisions. She said this would all be temporary. That was when something inside me settled. I wasn't angry. I was awake. I told them to leave. The lawyer protested gently, saying this wasn't over. He mentioned courts. He mentioned evaluations. He mentioned concern. I told him he was not welcome in my home. My son stood up abruptly. He said I couldn't just cut them off. He listed bills, rent, payments I had always covered. He said they had made plans based on my support. I told him those plans were not my responsibility. Nina's calm disappeared. Her voice sharpened. She said everything I had would be theirs one day anyway. She said they were just trying to manage things responsibly. There it was. The truth spoken without shame. I pointed to the door. I told all 3 of them to leave. They did. But not before my son turned back and told me I would regret this. He said I would end up alone. He said no one would take care of me when I needed help. The door closed behind them, and the house went silent. I stood there for a long moment listening to the quiet. Didn't feel lonely. Felt free. That night I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was clear and busy. I knew they wouldn't stop. I knew I needed to protect myself. And for the first time I was ready to do exactly that. By morning I had a plan, and my first call was to a lawyer of my own. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. I lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the quiet of the house. There was no tension in my chest this time. No rush to check my phone. No fear of missing a call that might change everything. I felt calm in a way I hadn't felt in years. After breakfast I made my first call of the day. Not to my son. Not to Nina. I called a lawyer. His name had been written in the back of my address book for years. I had met him once long ago, when my husband passed and I needed help settling matters I never imagined I would face so soon. His voice was steady and respectful, and he asked me to come in that morning. When I arrived at his office, he listened without interrupting. I told him everything. The wedding. The money. The canceled transfers. The lawyer they had brought into my home without permission. I told him how they spoke about my age, my judgment, my supposed confusion. When I finished, he folded his hands and looked at me carefully. He told me what they attempted had a name. He said it was financial exploitation of an elderly person. Hearing those words didn't frighten me. Clarified things. He explained that trying to pressure someone into signing control over their finances, especially after years of dependency, was serious. He said entering my home and reviewing my documents without consent made it worse. Then he asked me something simple. He asked if I wanted to protect myself. I told him yes. We spent hours going through records. He looked at bank statements and payment histories. He added numbers quickly and quietly. When he reached the final total, he shook his head. He told me I had been more than generous. He also told me generosity did not mean obligation. Before I left his office, we made a plan. Clear one. Locks would be changed. Access would be revoked. My will would be updated. Communication would go through legal channels if needed. When I walked back outside, the sky had brightened. The world looked the same, but I felt different inside it. My next stop was the hardware store. I had been there many times before, always buying things to fix problems in my son's apartment. This time I was buying for myself. I asked for new locks. Strong ones. Reliable ones. I also asked about security cameras. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted peace of mind. The man helping me didn't ask questions. He didn't judge. He simply listened and scheduled the installation. When I returned home, my phone showed several missed calls from unknown numbers. I knew who they were. I didn't answer. Instead, I made myself lunch and sat by the window. For the first time in years, my day belonged entirely to me. Later that afternoon, someone knocked on my door. It wasn't my son. It wasn't Nina. It was a woman from next door. She introduced herself kindly and said she had heard raised voices the day before, and wanted to make sure I was all right. I invited her in. We talked over coffee, and for the first time, I told my story to someone who wasn't trying to take something from me. She listened. She understood. And when she left, she squeezed my hand and told me I was brave. That evening, just as I was beginning to feel safe, my phone rang again, and this time it was a call I could not ignore. That evening, I was sitting in my living room with a book open in my lap when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. Normally, I would have ignored it. I had learned quickly that unfamiliar numbers often carried familiar intentions. But something told me this call was different. I answered. The woman on the other end introduced herself politely. Her voice was calm, professional, and measured. She said she worked with senior services and explained that she was calling to check on my well-being. My heart tightened, but I kept my voice steady. She told me a report had been made expressing concern about my recent behavior. She mentioned sudden financial changes, strained family relationships, and possible confusion. The words were carefully chosen, neutral on the surface, but heavy with implication. I understood immediately. When money failed, they had tried authority. I thanked her for calling and asked to see identification before discussing anything further. She agreed and asked if she could stop by the next morning. I told her she could, And after the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. I wasn't afraid. I was disappointed. I thought about how far my son was willing to go. I thought about how easily concern could be used as a weapon. I thought about how quickly a mother could be turned into a problem to be managed. The next morning, I dressed carefully again, not out of anxiety, but out of self-respect. When the woman arrived, she showed me her credentials. Everything was proper. Everything was official. I invited her in and offered coffee. She sat across from me with a clipboard resting on her knee and asked gentle questions. How was my health? Did I live alone? Did I manage my own finances? I answered honestly. I told her I paid my bills on time. I told her I drove myself. I told her I cooked, cleaned, and made my own decisions. I told her I had recently chosen to stop financially supporting my adult son and his wife. She asked why. I told her the truth. I explained the wedding, the money, the pressure, the attempt to take control of my finances. I told her about the lawyer they brought into my home without my consent. Her expression changed as I spoke. The concern shifted away from me and toward the situation itself. I showed her documentation, bank statements, records, notes from my attorney. I didn't rush. I didn't defend myself. I simply presented facts. When she finished reviewing everything, she closed her folder. She told me she saw no signs of risk or impairment. She said adults had the right to make decisions about their finances, even when family members disagreed. She said she would close the case. Relief washed over me, but it was quiet, controlled. Before she left, she looked at me kindly and said something I will never forget. She said, "Choosing yourself does not mean you are unwell." After she left, I stood by the window and watched her car drive away. I felt stronger than I had felt in years. But I also knew something else. They wouldn't stop yet. People who feel entitled to your life rarely let go easily. And just when I thought the worst was over, I saw their car outside my house again, this time with the police behind them. When I saw the police car outside my house, my first instinct was not fear. It was sadness. Not for myself, but for how far things had gone. I opened the door before anyone knocked. 2 officers stood on the porch, calm and professional. Behind them, across the street, my son's car was parked. Nina sat inside, staring straight ahead. One officer explained that they were responding to a welfare concern. He asked if I was safe. I told him I was. I invited them inside. They asked simple questions. Clear questions. I answered each one without hesitation. I showed them identification. I showed them documentation. I showed them the same records I had shown everyone else who had questioned my ability to live my own life. One of the officers glanced at the paperwork and nodded quietly. He asked if anyone had threatened me or attempted to pressure me. I told him yes. I told him everything. They stepped outside to speak with my son and his wife. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the body language. The confidence drained from them slowly. Shoulders stiffened. Voices rose then softened. After a few minutes, the officers returned. They told me no further action was needed. They told me I had done nothing wrong. They told me that if anyone came back without my permission, I could call them immediately. Before leaving, one officer looked at me and said something gentle. He said, "You're allowed to set boundaries, ma'am, even with family." After they drove away, my son did not come to the door. He left. That was the last time I saw him for a long while. The weeks that followed were quiet. Painfully quiet at first. There were moments when I missed the sound of obligation, the constant calls, the feeling of being needed. It takes time to unlearn the belief that love must cost you something. But slowly the quiet softened. I filled my days with small things. Morning walks. Coffee with my neighbor. Books I had been meaning to read for years. I joined a local group for women my age, and for the first time I told my story without shame. No one judged me. They understood. I updated my will. I named a medical advocate who respected my wishes. I put my plans in writing not because I feared the future but because I trusted myself. Months later, I received a short message from my son. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a request. It was silence in words. And I finally understood something important. You do not owe anyone access to your life just because you gave birth to them. Love does not require surrender. Support does not mean sacrifice. And peace is not something others grant you. It is something you choose. Today my home feels like mine again. My money reflects my values. My voice belongs to me. And if there is one thing I want anyone listening to remember, it is this. It is never too late to say no. It is never too late to choose yourself. And it is never wrong to protect the life you worked so hard to build. Because sometimes the strongest stories aren't about loss at all, but about the quiet power of finally taking your life back.